Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. We thank you for joining this workshop, which is building on a report published earlier this week with the title Accelerating the 10 Critical Transitions, Positive Tipping Points for Food and Land Use Systems Transformation. We've been really pleased to be contributing to that work with our colleagues at the Food and Land Use Coalition, or FOLU, and we very much hope that that report is the starting point of exploring a conceptual framework that we've been developing. And this webinar, to which you've all brought your diverse expertise and experience, will be part of shaping the next steps. So this is very much the beginning of a journey that we hope you'll join us on the rest of. So we're going to start with a couple of short presentations to introduce the work that we've been doing, developing and applying the framework so far, and then we'll move on to a Q&A with our two speakers, and then we've put aside a good chunk of time in the second half to ask for your feedback and your ideas in smaller groups for the rest of the session. So we're really pleased to have so many of you joining us, and with the numbers that we've got, I think we'll ask that you post questions for the Q&A in the chat, please, where I'll pick them up and then pitch them to Tim and Talia, our speakers, with some help from some of the others on the call. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers, who are Professor Tim Lenton, who's the Director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter, and also the Chair in Climate Change and Earth System Science. He's been particularly interested in how life has reshaped our planet in the past and what lessons we can draw from that as we proceed to reshape our planet now. And his past work identifying dangerous tipping points in the climate system has really led on to now examining the positive tipping points and the potential for positive tipping points in our social systems, which can help accelerate progress towards a more sustainable future. And after Tim, we'll hear from Talia Smith, who's co-head of knowledge generation at the Food and Land Use Coalition Secretariat, where she works on helping to deliver solutions to transform global food and land use systems to work better for people, nature and climate. And she's previously been an international development consultant designing infrastructure, land use and natural resource management programs across Africa and Southeast Asia. So Tim, I will hand over to you. And we've still got a couple of people joining. Hopefully you can share your screen and kick us off.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks everybody for joining us. Good to see Bob starting the introductions in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat while I'm chatting. Yeah, we're going to do a sort of take me going first and then Talia. So yeah, we're here today because we've been working together, we've come together as a team to both try and develop a framework for operationalizing positive tipping points towards sustainability. And then we've been trying that framework out in this critical area of food and land use systems transformation. So hopefully some of you have seen the report and we'll share links to it. There's also a complementary working paper, which is the bit I'm going to talk about now, which is trying to begin to develop a general framework for, how do we put into practice this idea of triggering positive tipping points to accelerate the change we need. Very much a work in progress. Looking forward to your inputs on it from this afternoon's session. So let me just get, that was exciting. So yeah, I'll concentrate on the framework and then we'll get into the specifics of food and land use systems transformation. Now, I expect we all know what the challenges we're facing. We need to change our global trajectory in the Anthropocene, and we need to really accelerate the transformative change that we know we need from the current rates of change. So one way to look at that is in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, which alas are still increasing on the green line. But we know that if we want to avoid those bad climate tipping points I've been working on for decades, we've got to halve those greenhouse gas emissions globally within a decade and get rid of them altogether within a generation, sometime before 2050 get to global net zero. So that means, you know, a 7% year-on-year reduction in emissions, and it means turning around an upward trajectory to a sharp downward one. But if we switched over to think about the ongoing decline of biodiversity, well, that's another trend going in the wrong direction that we've got to turn around, and we want to turn around quickly, especially with this recent report and proposal that we need to go from net biodiversity loss to net increase of biodiversity within this decade, and even try and get back to what's called full recovery of biodiversity by 2050. Well, if we're going to have any hope of achieving these goals, we really have to accelerate current rates of change. In the case of decarbonising the global economy, by roughly a factor of 5. And that's why we've come together to choose to focus on what are the ways that we really can accelerate change, and how could positive tipping points and reinforcing feedbacks be crucial to the acceleration of change we need. Because my honest appraisal is, I don't think any of us know how exactly to get to global net zero or to recover biodiversity at the speed that we need. So we need to get practical about change, accelerating change. Have we been here before? Have we been in a situation collectively as a species where we look at our situation and say to ourselves, we need to completely transform the way we're doing things? I'm not sure we've been in quite this situation, but clearly humans, we're here now today because of some past revolutions, some past complete global transformations in our relationship with the rest of the Earth system, if you like. I don't think the people who started the Neolithic agricultural revolution would have necessarily intended to change the whole course of human history or had that as their plan, but it was certainly propelled by reinforcing feedbacks, like the one between returning animal manure to the fields to grow even better crops. Of course, there's also the Industrial Revolution, and we can debate whether it was anybody's intention that the Industrial Revolution would transform the world, but it certainly became self-reinforcing, again through positive feedbacks like the one sketched at the bottom. And historically, I reckon there's one candidate for like a deliberate global transformation, deliberate on some people's part, and that would be the Green Revolution. So the sort of coupled development of dwarf wheat and rice varieties, intensification of agriculture, something we might be critiquing in this session, but that is often portrayed as a deliberate attempt to boost food production and support a growing human population, although it didn't start conceived of globally. It started in Mexico, and this is a picture of the person most famously associated with it, Norman Borlaug, in one of the fields in Mexico in 1970 with some of said dwarf wheat varieties. It then spread to India, other parts of Southeast Asia, and of course has kind of gone global. But we're now in this unique position where I think we collectively want to change our global trajectory, and we need to find ways of accelerating doing that. So then we come to this framework of positive tipping points. So we've opted for what in academia would be called a sort of dynamical systems model of positive tipping points. Like any model, you know, all models are wrong, but some are useful. But we think this way of thinking about the challenge is useful. So what it encapsulates is the idea that there are different stable states for systems, including here food and land use systems. There's usually negative feedbacks or damping feedbacks that maintain an incumbent stable state. But if we want to tip transformative change to some other way of doing things, what we're talking about in the transformation is a time where self-reinforcing positive feedback, self-amplifying processes take over the dynamics, if you like, and propel change. So if we want that to happen deliberately, then we need to be talking about, well, on the one hand, how can we strengthen the strongly reinforcing positive feedback loops that can propel transformative change to go faster? And we might also talk about how can we weaken the negative feedback that are in maintaining the incumbent state. in our report, and in the framework at the moment, we're placing more emphasis on strengthening the positive feedbacks, but equally in the discussions, let's talk about the weakening the negative feedbacks. And basically, to get to a tipping point, usually some work needs to be done. Arguably, it's work that's destabilizing the incumbent state. So we're going to talk about that as creating enabling conditions. And then at a tipping point, there's a different set of dynamics. You might think of it as a different set of interventions, perhaps, that can actually trigger a tipping point. And by definition, at a tipping point, a small change can make a big difference. So things should get easier at that point. And as I said, become self-propelling. So we've broken this down. We've tried to isolate, or what are some of the things and qualities that can create enabling conditions for positive tipping? And what are some of the actors and interventions that can trigger the positive tipping? But underneath all of this, or at the heart for someone like me, is thinking through what are the actual reinforcing feedbacks that we're trying to trigger that can propel accelerating change, and what's the associated model of tipping dynamics. And that's what I want to talk a tiny bit about. So there are, in the academic literature, loads of models actually of tipping points and tipping dynamics. I've come up with a categorization here of at least 8 classes of model. Most of these come from considering society or society and technology, so social technological systems in academic language. But there's a whole separate tradition of considering tipping points in ecological and social ecological systems. And it's quite interesting for a polymath like me that there's a sort of hidden dividing line here. There's very little crosstalk between those fields, but I believe we have to bring those together if we're going to talk about the social, ecological, technological systems of food and land use, for example. I won't go through all of these models, you'll be glad to hear. It is worth noting that there's a form of tipping point called here critical mass that crops up quite often in these models. And that's the idea that you can get to a point where one more person adopting a new norm or behavior or technology will trigger everybody who's left to adopt. So rather than go through all of them, I'll just give a taster of some of the reinforcing feedbacks that I think are critical for thinking about positive tipping points. So in the purely social realm, there's this phenomena that gets called social contagion. And at its heart, it's a model built on observations that we sometimes, or quite often, imitate our neighbours, and we can do so in the uptake of new norms, new technologies, and new behaviours. And there have been some recent stunning examples of that, including social contagion in the uptake of solar photovoltaic cells on people's roofs, where there's a lot of copying our neighbours going on in a good way. Here's a little movie scrolling through about 3 years of a part of the US in Colorado where you're seeing first-time customers in yellow and then referred customers for the uptake of solar panels on roofs. And you can kind of see the social contagion happening in front of your eyes. It's also happening for electric vehicles in several nations at the moment. A different kind of set of reinforcing feedbacks, but also crucial, are what economist complexity thinker Brian Arthur described as increasing returns. But these are, I think, fairly familiar to many of us. They are the fact that the more we make something or do something new, the better we get at making it or doing it. We all call that learning by doing. But also the more we make something, the more cheaply it can be made. That's called economies of scale in the common language. And then the more something is used, the more other technologies can emerge that make it more useful. I've chosen to call that technological reinforcement, but it's those reinforcing feedbacks that are behind these famous curves where the uptake of, say, new technologies starts slow and then shoots up before it saturates as the new dominant thing. And that's kind of a classic example of what's generalized, as some people will talk about it as S-curves. It is generalized in something called diffusion of innovations theory, which particularly promoted by Rogers in a book that he first published in 1962, I think. But anyway, the core idea in diffusion of innovations is there's always this acceleration phase. And with positive tipping points, you could argue that what we're talking about is how can we make that acceleration of change really steep? But in the general theory, it tends to break society down into these kind of cartoon segments of the innovators, followed by the early adopters, followed by the early majority, then the late majority, then the laggards. And we found that in our work as somewhat useful framework for thinking about the task ahead. And it's somewhat useful to know that there are typical ballpark figures for fractions of the population in these categories. The other idea that we're really anchoring on is we don't want to think just about tipping points in isolation. We want to think about, well, how might they cascade, for example, from a small spatial scale to a larger spatial scale, or from something that might be quite reversible in time to something that's much more persistent in time. Or another kind of cascade would be a tipping point that starts in one sector of society or the economy, but then could cascade to other sectors that could then maybe feed back on it. And I've used the red arrows here to highlight an example that's happening around us right now. So there's amazing economies of scale in renewable power. There are also amazing economies of scale in low-cost batteries for electric vehicles, including cars. Though low-cost battery storage is a great thing for the renewable energy revolution because it helps us balance out the fundamental challenge of imbalance between when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing and you can generate renewable power and when you have a demand for electricity. So in simple terms, these revolutions that are unfolding of EV uptake, cheaper batteries and ever cheaper renewable energy are feeding back on each other. And that's a kind of cascade. But we're here to talk about food and land use systems and what's cool about those in many things. But here we're really talking about bringing the ecology in. We're talking about bringing in the agency of other living things that are all just like human beings, trying to create their own conditions for survival and flourishing, be they wolves, elk, or any of the other creatures on this sketch. And what I want to say here is, well, it's well understood that from ecology that, and there have been successful efforts at doing it, that you can, with enough human effort, you can work with ecology to deliberately tip an ecosystem to a desired state. So a famous backstory here was that the localized extinction of grey wolves in Yellowstone National Park ended up totally transforming the Yellowstone ecosystem, but then subsequently the deliberate reintroduction of the wolves was able to tip the ecosystem back to a desired state. Another classic example of cascading change, started in one species, transforms the whole ecosystem. This is also true for another famous ecological example, that many lakes have become eutrophied, full of rich in nutrients and cyanobacteria, but often toxic blooms. But it is possible with considerable effort to tip lakes back into a desired state. And that's also true with some nice examples like mussel beds and how they stabilize mud flats and start creating conditions for salt marshes. These are super cool ecological systems in their own right. The mussels form these kind of natural self-organized patterns that help them stabilize the sediment and build this kind of unique stable state they have. But what's cool is some of the latest work in ecology is like human actors interacting with these ecological actors, the blue mussels, deliberately introducing the blue mussel ecosystem engineers who can then go to work to recover tidal mudflats and create better carbon stores, preferred ecological conditions, and of course something that can be harvested in a potentially sustainable way. So that's a little bit about the general framework. Just a few more words on what have we pulled out about actions, conditions that can create enabling conditions for positive tipping. Well, first of all, from all those models I was summarizing, it becomes clear that tipping often starts in smaller populations that need less people to reach critical mass. So that could be a natural target. Clearly lowering the price can bring technology towards different types of tipping points in these models. Improving quality or performance can also do the same thing for widgets or technology options. making something, a norm, a behavior or a product more desirable can certainly bring it towards a particular type of tipping point in some models, as can making a new option more accessible and convenient, and as can work on complementarity of different, for example, technologies. That making the coordinating complementary technologies can really help trigger these critical mass tipping points. Now, there's also often a role in the tipping point models for a role for information or the exposure to information, but of course it's context specific and it depends on what type of information, whether you can trigger a cascade or inhibit one. And the same sort of generic remark goes for social network structure. In some of these models, and in experience, it's very clear that changes in social network structure can enable tipping points of social contagion, for example, greater friendship in a network. But it's context specific. What kind of change in social network structure is going to be important? We think of that as step one, create enabling conditions. Step two is that we think there's a number of methods available to sense the potential for a system to be positively tipped. And I'm just showing you a little movie here, which is showing that before it gets to a tipping point, this toy model system was showing some telltale signs that it was getting near to being tipped. And that took the form of the ball rolling around in the valley slower as we got nearer the tipping point. And we can pick that up in simple terms with statistical mathematical methods. And the proposition here is, let's do some work, some of us together, on whether we can use that well understood early warning signal that a system is vulnerable to tipping. Can we pick that up and then use it as a clue to when to intervene to get the maximum bang for our buck, if you like, in triggering positive tipping? And then finally, the step of intervening and triggering positive tipping, we've been thinking quite hard about who are the interveners and what are the interventions that can actually make the final nudge across the tipping point. So these could fit into a whole range of categories. So social innovators who can tip social contagion, like Greta and Fridays for the Future movement. Ecological interventions where humans go into an ecosystem, deliberately tip it in a desired direction. What I'm calling social ecological innovation, where it's a kind of intertwined shifting of the social and the ecological system, like the community garden movement. Technological innovators obviously have a key role to play, as do several roles for policy interventions and public investment across different scales. They're usually first, followed by the private investment and markets, but don't underestimate the power of shifting private investment and markets. That's certainly been key to the global revolution in solar photovoltaic technology. And also sometimes public information and those who create and broadcast it can be critical to tipping points. We might think of the marine plastic pollution awareness triggered by BBC Blue Planet 2 program. And then there's behavioural nudging. There are some cases where that's been shown to be key to triggering some positive tipping points, for example, levies on single-use plastic shopping bags. So that was a bit about the framework. It's a work in progress, and the bits that we're most interested to develop are, it's a little bit reductive as the way I've described it, as in lots of pieces, lots of separate actors. What we want to think about with you and together is how can we develop a thinking on who working together, so different actors coming together to make positive tipping points happen even more effectively, and which order should they act, if you like. And then of course the critical issue of how do we ensure this is a just transformation, because one can easily see that when you have the power of triggering positive tipping points, it could be abused like any other power. So with that, I'm going to finish and hand over to Talia to take this in a more concrete direction towards food and land use systems transformation.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I'm just going to share my screen now. Give me one moment while we switch over. Can I check you can see my screen? Maybe a thumbs up.
Yeah, just needed to switch to full screen.
There we go. Thank you all so much. And thank you so much, Tim, for that amazing presentation. I wanted to just say a quick word of introduction before launching in. And Tom, you very kindly introduced both Tim and myself at the outset of this. And I just wanted to reinforce what you said, which is that you know, we were joined together a couple of months ago because we were both really interested in how do we take the science and the emerging evidence and really apply this in as useful way as possible. And so I'm really grateful to the Global Systems Institute for affording us at the Food and Land Use Coalition that opportunity to work together. For those of you who don't know the Food and Land Use Coalition, just a very brief word on who we are. So we were founded in 2017. We're actually a community of organizations that works across the world globally and also in specific countries. We work in Colombia, Ethiopia, Indonesia, in China, and India. And we also have affiliated platforms in the UK and in Australia. And we're all globally and in specific countries united by a shared vision for transformation. So we believe, as Tim said better than I could ever, that, you know, where we are now, where our current state is in the system is not sustainable for many reasons. It's not sustainable in order to keep our planet within planetary boundaries. It's also not sustainable from a sort of human and social and indeed health perspective. So that's what brought us all together, is a shared vision that we need deep structural transformation to our societies, to our economies, and to our ecological systems. But the real hard question is, how do we do that, and where do we want to go? So FOLU, a couple of years ago, produced this report which tried to do part of that. We tried to say, well, this is where we are today from a global food and land use system perspective, and this is where we need to be. This is what our better future looks like. And we believe in a very hopeful and very positive way that it is possible to feed 9 billion people on this planet. It's possible to do so within planetary boundaries, and it's possible to do so while providing healthy, nutritious, and affordable food for all. The how is, of course, the important question, and we've set out a transformation agenda that we call 10 critical transitions. It starts by shifting our diets, but it also really fundamentally transforms how we produce and consume food. This is our reform agenda, but we're also very humble in that this is not the end of the how story. And so that's why we became increasingly interested in trying to understand how positive tipping points can help us accelerate this transformation, the realization of these 10 critical transitions at speed and at scale. So not to undermine the reform agenda we've set out, quite the contrary. We really believe in it, but it's actually about how do we double down and make sure this happens, noting how also hard and unprecedented, and in many ways, deep structural transformation really is. So with that, the purpose of this report, as Tim has already said, is really to help develop a framework and a theory and a hypothesis for how that can happen. And on top of that, we wanted to reaffirm our own belief that this transformation is possible and provide a very positive and hopeful message that, that we can do this, and that through intervening in the system, through understanding the ways in which our systems operate and interact, that we can really catalyze and achieve those systemic tipping points. I also wanted to just take a moment and reinforce the why now question, which is that not only do we have you know, this critical decade ahead of us, but there's also what people are calling the 2021 super year of international summits. And we've particularly highlighted the role that policymakers in one of the two reports, we've particularly highlighted the role that policymakers can play in terms of creating some of those enabling environments for change. But at these summits as well, there's also a real moment of uniting and raising the ambition for all actors, for business leaders, for investors, for civil society, for individual citizens, indeed the future Gretas of the world who can really help send that message and create that kind of positive message of hope. So with all of that context in mind, you've heard about the framework from Tim. I'm now just going to take you very briefly through how we've applied that through some of our critical transitions. And apologies for using the FOLU terminology, the 10 critical transitions, but I'm going to show you how we've done this in 3 different case studies. The first case study we looked at is related to 2 of our critical transitions: the need to shift what we eat towards more healthier and sustainable diets. We look specifically at Europe, and so in the European context, we've also included a second critical transition, which is the need to diversify protein supply and to shift towards more plant-based diets, in recognition of the fact that in Europe, and indeed not all of Europe is the same, there is on the whole an overconsumption of animal source protein. The dietary shift will look very, very different all over the world. And indeed, in many parts of the world, we actually need to increase animal source protein consumption. But this case study looks particularly at the European context. The second case study we look at is the ways in which we can shift towards more productive and regenerative agricultural systems in India. In part, this is because the FOLU coalition operates and it works on these topics in India, but also because of the historical context that Tim has identified in terms of the Green Revolution and its historical context, despite the fact that it started in Mexico, is also very frequently associated with the rapid uptake in India. And the third case study we look at is the really urgent need to protect and restore nature, and in particular, the need to halt deforestation in tropical regions. So we look in tropical countries for our third case study. And what we do, I'm actually going to start with India and go through to forests and end on diets. But what we do for each of these case studies is try and identify, using our framework of conditions, what would those conditions need to look like in order, hypothetically, for a tipping point to be met. And then we explore in a bit of detail what the current state looks like, what evidence there is to see how close we are towards meeting that condition, and what barriers exist in really inhibiting progress towards that tipping point. And what we're really interested in, as Tim has summarized, is not only the conditions, but the ways in which this can teach us and let us try and better understand the reinforcing feedback loops that are needed to go from small localized interventions through to systemic transformation. In the case of India, when we look at conditions like economic competitiveness or performance, this is really about the business model at the farm level that is necessary and available for farmers. So it's looking about and of course, this is going to be entirely dependent on crop varieties and production systems in India, of which there are many. But we have to take into consideration the ways in which farmers would need the business model to be fundamentally a viable economic model in order for a transition to be made from a conventional practice towards a sustainable or regenerative one. And that has to include not only the economic viability of the model, but also the cost of transition. We also need to consider the various performance indicators in terms of yield, as well as returns to livelihoods, as well as the provision of nutritious and resilient crops. I'm not going to go through every single indicator, but that gives you a little bit of an understanding of how we've tried to approach the question of whether or not we can assess how close or how far away from a tipping point we are in the Indian context. When it comes to deforestation-free supply chains and how we can halt and indeed protect tropical forests, we've actually split this out into looking at both the supply and demand side. So when it comes to questions of accessibility, thinking about forest positive products that can actually bring value to standing forests, as well as on the demand side, in improving traceability and transparency, so consumers have access to better understand and be able to purchase deforestation-free products. And that, of course, isn't only exclusive to tropical forest countries such as Indonesia, but is actually globally thinking about our supply chain. I'm going to come back to the case of diets in Europe and go into a little bit more detail in this case study. We have some slides, some visualizations to show you here. But in the European context, when we think about performance and economic competitiveness, many of you will be much more knowledgeable than I am about the rapid availability these days of alternative protein products, the increase in alternative protein products in Europe. There's an increasing interest and indeed investment in alternative plant-based proteins, different kinds, as well as meat alternatives. It's worth caveating that at the moment, that's increasing the availability of supply, but it's actually not having an effect on reducing meat consumption in Europe. But both of those factors are really important. And where we also evaluate in our paper, we look at things like accessibility, where we still have a ways to go in terms of ensuring that alternative protein supplies and more plant-based alternatives are available, accessible, and indeed priced competitively with meat alternatives. And indeed, where there are perhaps shifting cultural and social norms in terms of choice architecture of consumers that will need to be normalized throughout society for a tipping point to occur. So what does this look like visually? Tim showed you the diffusion of innovation theory, and we have overlaid this with what this might look like for a dietary shift in Europe. And once again, just to emphasize, this is a hypothesis, so we haven't tested this yet. But what you would see on the left is the adopter categories that Tim went through earlier. And we've overlaid that with the different habits, the meat consumption habits of consumers. And again, this is hypothetical. So if we were to see a large scale tipping point in Europe and a shift in our dietary patterns, what this shows us is actually we would need to focus on the lower left-hand quadrant and how we can create how we can create some of those feedback loops that would lead us towards that towards that large-scale tipping point. Zooming into the left-hand quadrant, what does this mean hypothetically? So we, in the report, demonstrate what might a plausible sequencing of policy interventions be. Tim mentioned the role of policy, which tends to come first, not that it's more or less important than the role of the private sector and others, but we have identified some early interventions, for example, around innovation and investment that can really drive some of the performance conditions that are necessary to create those feedback loops. We also see a really strong role of public procurement and financial incentives that can help address some of the price and convenience conditions. We also see a very strong role of national dietary guidelines, as well as other types of regulatory intervention to govern advertising and marketing that can help shift cultural norms and capability conditions as well. And again, what that does, and you can see on the graph, is how that will help create some of the feedback loops around social contagion, as well as increasing returns that Tim has summarized. At the same time as we have that increasing feedback loop, we also have downward pressure on the curve. And this will come in the form of consumer backlash or pressures against incumbent lobbying. We recognize that in our framework, we haven't, at least in the presentation today and in the papers you'll see, we recognize the really important role of exogenous factors as well as downward pressures on the curve. This is really important. So I'd love to, in the breakout groups, hear your thoughts on that aspect of the framework as well. To conclude, before I hand back, I think, to Tom to then take us into the breakouts, we hope that you have found this an interesting theory-driven approach, again, caveating that we haven't tested it yet, but we believe that this kind of approach, which uses the science and the evidence of positive tipping points and tries to apply it within certain systems and certain aspects of the food and land use system, but this can be an important way of helping us identify where and how interventions can enable that kind of transformational change. Tim already talked about how we want to develop this further and develop methods for identifying the proximity of our systems towards positive tipping. And we, again, are reinforcing the role of policy action in creating some of the conditions for system tipping, but in no way undermining the role of each and every one of us in this global transformation that needs to happen. In case you don't make it through the entire report, I'll jump to the very end, which is where we reinforce a message for all you Star Wars fans from Yoda. We believe this message of hope is inspiring, but is also it's necessary, this transformation, as Tim said. So I'll leave you with a quote from Yoda, which is that we must do or do not, and there is no try. Thank you all very much. Tom, I'm going to hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Talia. We've got time for a bit of a Q&A all together here before we go into breakout groups, and it's been great to see your conversation in the chat. There's been lots of discussion already with specific examples of particular tipping points, and lots of really interesting discussion. Lots of people really interested in really applying this framework, which I think is brilliant. That's exactly the spirit we wanted to bring to this conversation. So you touched a little bit on this, Talia, but maybe we can expand a bit, both you and Tim. Clearly policy has a really important role to play in helping to trigger these tipping points. But what kind, so David Pension has asked, what kind of legal and regulatory changes can help to normalize fringe activities and start them off on the transition, on that beginning of that log curve? And connected to that, Jonathan Gosling has asked, if we think about a deliberative lobbying framework, what kind of lobbying actions by corporations, NGOs, or social movements is effective in driving better regulatory and tax regimes that can support these transitions? Do you want to take that first, Talia?
Sure. I'll give it a go, and then I very much would love to hear, Tim, your thoughts. So in terms of legal and regulatory interventions, one of the examples that we look at, especially in the context of the dietary transition in Europe, is actually in relation to kind of halting some of the bad activity, if I can call it bad, forgive my language. And this is really kind of influencing the ways in which we are currently not regulating the kinds of advertising to youth, for example, around unhealthy food choices. And that's not really in relation to meat per se, but actually across the entire kind of balance of a diet that we need. But we on the whole want to be encouraging and advocating for greater consumption of plants and vegetables, and we want a balanced diet across various protein choices. At the moment, without that kind of regulatory intervention, it's especially for youth, it's just there's quite a lot of money that's going into kind of advertising the bad stuff. So that's one example. In terms of the tax regimes, I actually didn't go through this on the slide, but one of the again, in relation to the dietary shift example in Europe, obviously things like a carbon tax can be perceived as quite difficult to come into effect. Of course, we've been trying to do that in many parts of the world for a long time. But we believe that by having some of those earlier interventions around innovation and actually trying to create the availability of other products and helping to progress some of the earlier conditions earlier on, that helps to normalize and sensitize some of the consumers towards and create some of the feedback loops around information that can help normalize behavior and people's attitudes towards, for example, a carbon tax. And we see that in parts of Europe, which then means that when it's time to introduce some of new kinds of tax regimes, it becomes perhaps easier than it would have been if that were one of the first interventions. I'll probably leave it there. I'm sure I'm missing countless other examples. So Tim, maybe over to you.
Thanks, Talia. Yeah, so on legal and regulatory changes, well, one of the elephants in the room in Europe is the common agricultural policy, still subsidizing ongoing destruction of biodiversity and a bunch of completely unprofitable farming activities. And despite what's being said about reforming it within Europe, setting aside our choice to depart, despite claims that are being made that things are being greened up or whatever, Kim Nicholas, shout out to her, is showing in recent work that the reality is not matching the rhetoric. So that's a classic case of extremely powerful framework, shall we say, that we should be, I would say, lobbying, or European citizens will be wise to lobby to continue to change. In terms of David's question about how can policy boost sort of these little islands of innovation, well, it does it a number of ways. One that might appeal to you, David, is as well as creating sort of the protection and the initial support and public money subsidy for something that when it starts small doesn't have the economies of scale. One of the clever tricks is when you make the public sector, when you basically make them the customer of the new green innovation, because that can be quite a big market, as you well know, coming from the NHS. And that's a really clever trick that's been used, certainly in the UK in the past, to get a niche activity starting to build up. Jonathan, I love the question about what kind of deliberative lobbying framework. I don't think I have the answer. I just have this. I just think we should all cogitate on how do we effectively lobby for action, not just rhetoric and changing, goals or great claims that we're all going to be net zero. It's worth nothing without the action to follow through on it. So yeah, sometimes I feel like our protest movements are wonderful, but they need to be more. They need to have a clearer idea of what they're protesting, demanding for particular actions, rather than just sort of political statements of intent. And I think that's quite opposite in this sector, particularly in the parochial UK context of Brexit and leaving the cap and having the opportunity to do, a completely different incentive regime for how farmers, land users, landowners change or don't change the face of the UK. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks both for those responses. Some nice observations as you were speaking there about the amount of advertising for meat-based fast foods during the football match last night. Very visible location. Maybe connected to what you were just talking about, Tim, about supporting those initial islands of innovation. Rayan Vitelli is asking, how can we identify these small populations and islands of innovation, and how do they vary from region to region or across the world?
I guess some of us self-identify with said islands of innovation. We might, be proud to be part of transition towns or something else that because we're in it, we can kind of see that something different's going on, even if it starts in a niche and it starts to grow. But if you want the objective scientist's answer, what we're trying to do in the Global Systems Institute is begin to deploy methods that we had developed to spot kind of tipping points in natural systems, trial those out on data from entwined social and ecological systems, because we have, quite objective ways of detecting abrupt change or distinct behaviors or different things in a complex system. I think it's just the beginning. There might be quite a big research agenda there, but no one's really tried it before. So we're just starting to try that. So we use methods of analyzing time series data or spatial data to look for, if you like, for the anomalies and also for anomalous rates of change. But we also look dynamically in the way I tried to show with that little cartoon, that if we can watch the behavior of systems over time, we can see something about the feedbacks, and when, for example, the positive feedbacks are suddenly starting to kick in. Talia.
Talia, I suppose the sort of globally distributed nature of a network like FOLU can be useful in helping to identify that global variation.
Absolutely, Tom. It's certainly part of our theory of change. We call them proof points. We need very, very localized examples, because of course when we're talking about agricultural production systems, it has to be locally specific. We need examples that start small, and we need to show how those connect globally. I also think, just a general observation, is that we don't have enough of those kinds of case studies documented in the scientific literature. And so I think there's a real role, and as Tim was saying, a really big research agenda, not only to develop the methods and the tools to be able to do some of that sensing, but also just more documentation of what some of those small scale innovations might be, and then testing those at scale. Of course, we've spoken a lot today about how urgent our situation is. So we need to balance being able to quickly identify where there are small scale innovations and really helping to amplify those at scale quite urgently. Thanks, Tom.
Brilliant, thanks. We're going to move on to breakout sessions very shortly, but maybe given that sense of urgency, a final question from Ed Davey, who asks, what does the COP26 presidency need to achieve by way of minimum tipping points to achieve its vision of deforestation-free global supply chains?
Shall I, or Tim, do you want to go first?
You have a first go, Talia.
Sure, and hi Ed, great question. One of the things that the COP26 presidency is doing right now is bringing together over 25, I think 27 countries together to have a dialogue around what's possible in terms of working towards a global norm for deforestation-free supply chains. It's actually called the FACT Dialogue, and it is also a bringing together of both the producer and consumer countries. That kind of dialogue is absolutely powerful for creating the kind of identification and really helping use this framework to test with those countries where and how to intervene in a system. It creates the information flows, a cascading feedback loop, and helps to create a sort of dissemination of information within that group. Now, of course, as Tim was saying, it needs to be more than just rhetoric and sort of high level commitment. It needs to be real action. So having an idea of what sort of concrete interventions might be necessary, whether or not that's moratoriums of peatland conversions in Indonesia, or whether or not that's commitments to due diligence in supply chains, and commitments to greater transparency on the consumer end is really important. There's not one single thing that the COP presidency can do other than really facilitating those dialogues and facilitating the kinds of examples of commitments, real actions that those governments can take. But I think they're doing a fantastic job. If anyone's from the COP26 presidency on the line, I think it's a real transformative moment that can help deliver these goals.
Yeah, thanks, Talia. Yeah, I mean, we both have some experience with teaming up with the team, and I work in particular with Simon Sharp in the COP26 team. And my knowledge of what they're up to is actually better informed on some other aspects of the grand challenge, but including how to push the Powering Past Coal Alliance even further, for example. But I suppose the general message of strategy working with Simon is there's this recognition that we've tried in the past for this idea of a multilateral agreement, particularly on climate, that everyone signs up to, but it turns out to be so weak in the form of the Kyoto Protocol that it's barely worth the paper it's written on. We've then swung to the other extreme of unilateral non-binding commitments in the Paris Agreement, and that's pretty ineffectual as well, to be blunt. So if there is an answer, it must lie somewhere between those extremes, and that's why Simon and the team are working very hard on what are the smaller group sub-coalitions of countries or actors that need to come together with a shared vested interest in making the transformation happen quicker, because it's in their interest to do that. And he and I have certainly worked on which countries have to come together to shut down coal burning globally more effectively. That's kind of like a coalition of the bad guys. But we've also looked at the electric vehicle transformation, and it's pretty easy to identify what coalition is going to be effective there. And I think that's got to be true for our food and land use transformations. In each case, one can pull out the key actors that together, because of these tipping dynamics, if they act together in their shared interest, they can tip the dynamics so that everybody else will follow. And that's the philosophy that's going on behind the scenes, well before and hopefully after COP26. And it's the one I certainly support as a model of creating effective change.
Brilliant, thank you both. We're going to move on to the breakout sessions now, and we'll have about 40 minutes in those. I think most of you signed up to a particular breakout session when you signed up to this session. I know we've got some issues with the email addresses you've logged into Zoom on, so a few of you might have to wait a couple of minutes to be assigned to a breakout session once you start, but I can see loads of chat developing around alternative healthy diets and alternative proteins in the chat, so I'm sure that's going to be a lively group. And we'll look forward to seeing you back here at about 25 to 4 for a wrap up and a report back. So I'm going to hand over to Guy now, who's going to press the button and send us all into our breakout sessions. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Just so everyone knows what to expect. So about half of you have been successfully pre-assigned to groups, so you should get a notification inviting you to join those groups. If you don't get a notification, I think I'll just throw it open so you can choose the group that you're interested in. We have 5 groups. We have group one on diversifying protein supply, so 5 groups across the 3 case studies that Talia mentioned. So we have group 1 on diversifying protein supply, groups 2 and 3 on scaling regenerative agriculture, and groups 4 and 5 on protecting and restoring nature. So please join a group that you're interested in, and I will manually kind of rebalance numbers if we look like we're too uneven. I think at the moment we have the fewest for group 1, so if a few people could pitch in there, that would be great as well. I think also Victor, you need to be in group, I think 3, and Talia, you might need to manually join group 5, just to make sure everyone is in the right place. All right, I'm going to hit open all rooms, and hopefully this goes smoothly.
Great. I think we've got nearly everybody back. Are you able to see, Guy?
Yeah, we're at 48. We were about 60 participants before, but I think a few might have dropped off. Let's check the breakouts.
Cool. Well, I hope everybody had as productive and involved a session as we did. It's brilliant to have so much expertise and so much connection to really inspiring activity that's happening all over the place. So you can really kind of sense the power for generating something forward-looking out of this. We're going to go around quickly the rapporteurs from each of the group and just hear a quick snapshot of what we've discussed before we move on to some closing words. So group 1 was, Jesse, were you reporting group 1? Yeah.
Yeah, so we talked generally about some barriers, those including cultural and social norms. Okay, first of all, sorry, we were talking about the transition to alternative proteins. So one of the main barriers that we see is social and cultural norms, as well as regulations. And we try to identify some kind of entry points to try and get past these barriers. We talked a little bit about insect protein, how in general, something like entering into a pet food market might be a good entry point to shift perception a little bit. We also identified that regulations on using things such as insect protein to even feed animals is a barrier because there's very stringent regulations, and due to these regulations, it actually makes feeding animals soy a lower impactful option. We also talked a little bit about changing tastes and using children as a potential kind of way to get into society and spread and have diffusion throughout society. One idea was, instead of currently in the UK, schools have to give meat 3 days a week. One potential was to change that to having a vegan meal 3 days a week. Whether people would accept that is another question. We also talked a little bit about trying to make people more familiar with alternative foods. So one person brought up the point that cooking something like tofu is a bit more complicated than preparing meat, when in reality it may not be, but people are not familiar with it. We also talked about a bit about subsidies, or about how there will be some losers in the transition to alternative protein. So we need to make mechanisms so that farmers, for instance, can transition to alternative proteins without being too big of a loser. And the last thing we mentioned was, and it got cut off in the middle, but I thought it was actually really interesting, was I think it was Susan who was talking about it, was the way that things are visualized is very powerful. So things such as how food is packaged could also, nice packaging could actually attract people to try alternative sources of protein or alternative foods. And there was a lot more, but I didn't get to summarize it all yet.
Thanks, Jesse. Josh, I think you were group 2 with me.
Yep. Yeah, so I was in group 2, which we were talking about scaling regenerative agriculture. As part of this, we spoke a lot about different networks and in particular like farming networks and how change can be affected through those networks. There was a lot of discussion about knowledge dissemination and how can you access farmers. There was some consideration given to the tipping point model that we'd been discussing. Have I frozen? No, still good. So the tipping point model that we've been discussing about whether conceptually it's very vast and maybe slightly abstract, and how do we give consideration to very specific people in very specific places that we're trying to affect change with. And there was talk about how we need to kind of get out of the sort of academic structure and engage with people on the ground and provide funding for people on the ground who are actually doing this kind of thing.
Thanks, Josh. Who was reporting for group 3? Is that Lizzie?
Yes, it is. Group 3 was also discussing scaling regenerative agriculture. And we started the conversation, I think the group really liked the framework, but there was a need to talk about more specific examples and maybe more basic examples to kind of meet people and meet farmers where they are and then take it from there. So what does it mean more practically for people at different levels of income? We had, I hope Oliver, you don't mind me mentioning, we had a great organic farmer, Oliver, who shared a great story about a pig farmer he met in his neighborhood who, was able to switch to all pesticide-free farming and sent a video around about the impacts of pesticides to his community and got no response. So I think that really illustrated that it's even when people can see the benefits, they sometimes can't escape the system that they're in. And we talked about how there's really a need for regulation and legal frameworks and policy here to help support farmers. We also had a representative from the EU Parliament, Anna, who talked about how the EU, but notably also other countries like Brazil, China, US, and India are making a lot of progress here. She mentioned the Farm to Fork plan and a lot of the 2050 carbon neutrality goals of the EU to support farmers along this strategy. One of those being to preserve 25% of land for organic farming by 2030, and how are we going to do that across different countries who are at different stages of implementation. I really liked this quote, which was from Bob, trying to make common sense into common practice, and that we are not really going to be able to change the system without further support from policy, finance, regulation, and corporation of agribusiness. And then we ended our conversation really just focusing on this idea of how can we help local farmers. And we needed to have a discussion at the local level, right? And make it tangible across, communities and across different local systems. But looking at all of the policy changes that have to happen can be somewhat overwhelming. So there's really a need to prioritize and make sure that we focus on exactly what could be the most influential political levers that we can pull. Then we talked about how, many of the farmers are unhappy with the way that they've been made to farm in the system. So we are better off engaging them so that they're not left out of the transition, but are part of it. And change seems less daunting when we approach it from this perspective. Finally, we had a conversation about soil health and the use of chemicals. And I thought this was particularly interesting as we talked about the indigenous people and traditional farming practices that we've sort of strayed away from. But that could be a really interesting case study, and something that the group was interested in taking forward and discussing further as we apply the framework to healthy soils. So hopefully I did you justice, Tim. Yeah, good. Thanks everyone for this great discussion.
Thanks, Lizzie. And as you can see, people are sort of filling in group in the chat, and please do flag anything else that you feel was valuable from your groups that the rapporteurs have missed. Danine, do you want to give us a quick summary from Group 4?
Yeah, sure. We had a hybrid of protecting and restoring nature and a little bit on regenerative agriculture. So our discussions were mostly centered around the applicability of the framework and how useful it is to use this reinforcing feedback lens to see how the small scale interventions all link up and we can foster the new interventions that are proposed. There was also a lot of conversation around the importance of bottom-up approaches, how to have that for a long-term investment in the community to sort of prolong these changes and to make it successful, but how this is like a really fragile balance of how to get it right and what sort of approach is needed. Kirsten gave some really useful examples with her work in the Peak District. And then we also talked about the usefulness of how vague the framework can be and how that's useful for being flexible and transferable, but potentially you may need some more case studies relevant to UK situations to make it more applicable for other stakeholders to use and apply. And then we finished on something really interesting about the mechanism of accountability and how that's going to be really crucial in holding people to account for their changes, as opposed to, say, what's proposed at the moment, so like the reliance on technology advancements and stuff like that. Accountability and how we uphold that will be really important.
Thanks, Danine. And lastly, we have Andy for Group 5.
Group 5 was a beautiful group. It was very, very international. A great mix of people from students to startups. We took a little while to get going, but we warmed up. We got some sticky notes on the Jamboard at the end, and so positive about the framework. It's a simple concept that maybe policymakers can understand. The way it brings together elements such as the social and ecological tipping points. We touched on a couple of issues. So, for example, does the framework consider where the power lies in a system? Who has the power, be it financial or political, and how that can be recognised in the framework, and how does one address that? Also, in terms of, we had some of a fantastically interesting startup around really sort of, as the phrase was, turbocharging the production of seedlings for hedging or tree planting and that. But how can you identify the amount of land or area you need to change to get to that critical mass to then have a positive tipping point? Because you can do that, you can really help then the farmers, and then really help your business model. And at the end, we were starting to talk specifically, as we had some participants from Indonesia, about the challenges there, increasing population, real pressures on land use, and yet there's, particularly amongst the younger generation, very low awareness of the importance of agriculture and some of these issues around biodiversity. And yet you have a population that are heavy social media users. And so we were just starting to get into some interesting discussions there at the end about, not only the challenges, but where some of the solutions might lie with this framework.
Brilliant, thank you, Andy. Now, the original programme had us going on to some closing remarks now, but I think Tim and Talia were going to prepare very brief ones, and we've still got 10 minutes left. So Tim suggested I open up for any plenary comments at this stage, or further pressing questions from the audience, maybe sort of especially about how we go on and keep developing this work and take it forward into applications. Tim, did you have anything you wanted to add now?
Yeah, no, spot on, Tom. I think Talia and myself, we would love to have suggestions for further case studies or deep dives we might do, and some of those have certainly come out of the breakout group I was in that Lizzie so nicely summarised. So we kind of got the organic farming, especially the case study of its expansion in Europe, with a policy target to go from 8.5 to 25% of land under organic farming by 2030. And we also had something around this regenerating the soil and the soil microbiome. But we'd love to hear at this point, and before we close, if there's other good suggestions of what we might do a deeper dive on. I think there were some in those rapporteur summaries, and I should listen better.
May I make a suggestion? Sorry to jump in.
Please do.
Basically, I know we need to spread the regenerative message across the globe, but if we can enable our farmers, our agronomists, our vets, all the people that go up farm tracks to upskill it for free with online platforms, with regional events, if we can help farm clusters get created so that those farmers can work better together to diversify what they're producing for the local market, at the same time apply for higher level ELMS funding, that would be fantastic. I can't think bigger than the UK, I'm afraid, but I know it's easier done here than elsewhere, but I can only think locally, and that would be my thought for a way forward.
Thanks, Holly. That links nicely to the conversation we were having about how that whole network of the agricultural service industry can be a huge kind of reinforcer of the status quo, but maybe there's an opportunity there to help it become an agent of change as well. I'm looking for other hands, but please do just, Theo.
Thanks, Tom. I wonder if, I mean, we talked a lot about like social media and youth as sort of agents for change and the intergenerational exchange that comes from children to their parents and to other people they engage with. And I know this is very much within that sort of social contagion feedback loop, but behavior change from a specific generation, and can you sort of, is it still that sort of 20% threshold within the younger generation that then can really, really trigger even an older generation, and how that sort of like intergenerational exchange works? And I mean, that could be for diets, but also sort of how people act in other ways in their life that can support sort of nature and biodiversity as well, and where their food has come from regenerative farming or not. So I guess you can tap into all that elements of sustainability within sort of one generation, and it might be something interesting to look into more.
Brilliant, thanks. Nicola, you've got a virtual hand up there.
Yeah, I thought of a possible case study. What about seaweed farming as a source of sustainable food, particularly in Europe? Because obviously in some parts of the world, it's very much a source of food and farm at the moment, but there is a lot of interest in it. There's a lot of things bubbling around, but obviously one of the big barriers is getting that change in perception of seaweed being something we eat in Europe, you know, regularly, and becoming part of our diets, and also potentially something around working with the fisherman community to diversify into seaweed farming as a kind of more sustainable income source as well.
Brilliant, thanks. Catherine Bearfield, a hand.
No, it was just a question about the food equity chain. No, the fact that farmers are so outrageously badly paid, and that the vast proportion of money recuperated at retail goes to retail and to processors and so on. No, I mean, I don't know if any kind of work is being done in terms of connections across the various bits of the chain to make it more equitable, and also just involving corporates, all these food processors and so on, and sort of, you know, trying to establish better practices. I just wondered what's known about that.
Thanks, Catherine. I know that idea of equity is absolutely part of the 10 critical transitions model that FOLU have outlined, and it's something that I think very carefully about in the case study we have in East Africa. So, but absolutely, I think it's fundamental here in the UK too. Any other hands? In that case, maybe with our last 5 minutes, we'll move on to some closing remarks from Tim and Talia. But thank you all very much for your company, and we look forward to developing these ideas. Over to you. Who's going first? Tim?
No, I'm going to let Talia lead this time, if she's okay with it.
Very happy to, and I'll be very brief. Always love ending a session early to give everyone a comfort break, undoubtedly before your next meeting, or for some of you who've joined us from Southeast Asia, especially from my group, you probably keen to get to bed. So I just really wanted to thank each and every one of you for joining today. I've learned a tremendous amount, and I've loved the really rich discussion in the chat, as well as the case studies you've just mentioned right now. I would really love to continue working with you all, and I'm sure it goes the same for Tim and colleagues at the University of Exeter. We'd really love to help brainstorm more how we take this framework, make it more applicable, build the bottom-up evidence and work from the bottom up as well as the top down, build the tools, the analytical tools, as well as hard practical evidence that we need to really transform our food and land use systems, as well as our broader social, ecological, and economic systems. So just a real plea, and I had a slide, but I don't need to share it now. We'll pop our email addresses in the chat to just get in touch with us. Any questions, any comments, and just a real plea to help us on this journey. We need your fantastic brains. So thank you. With that, I'll hand over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Talia. Yeah, let me echo the enthusiastic thanks for everybody mucking in on the farm in this session for the last couple of hours. It's been brilliant. As I hope we've conveyed, this is the beginning, and we want to keep developing a bigger set of potential case studies. And really, although my sort of framework side of things seems quite abstract, we're committed to the idea that we'll only get a more effective or useful framework through case studies, through trying it out and tweaking it. So we're saying we want to get stuck in and do that kind of interplay. So your suggestions for other case studies to take on are great. Our intention is to try to get some support for this work, and therefore do a deep dive over the next, say, 18 months to do a deep dive into several more case studies and refine the framework that way. But I guess we're all here because of that shared feeling that we really have to accelerate transformative action now. So it always heartens me to see I'm not alone in that feeling, and that loads of you from completely different parts of the world and sectors and areas of activity are feeling the same. And one of the motivators for us to come up with this approach was to try to get us all out of that horrible sinking feeling that it's all just too complex, and if I do something and everybody else doesn't do something, nothing will happen, or we could do something here, but what about the people over there? We're really hoping that this way of thinking helps provide some hope and some plausible grounds for hope to get out of that kind of what I think of as the paralysis of complexity into a happy place where actually some of the complexity and what we call the non-linearity is our friend. It's our friend in making the change we want to happen. So yeah, I could show that slide without emails on, but I'll just put mine in the chat to show, and as Talia nicely said, we'll be welcoming your engagement as we carry on with this. And thanks to those amongst you who already today in the session gave us some concrete examples of case studies they would love us to work on with them. We hope we can pick that up. Yeah. Tom, up to you, boss.
Thank you very much, everybody. Well, that's 1 minute to 4, so that seems like a perfect time to close. And as Talia said, have a brief break before your next session. Hope to see you all in the real world one day, and please do get in touch. Take care.
Thank you, Tom, for excellent sharing. Thank you.
Excellent.
See you soon.
Really great, guys. Thank you.
Good day.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Good luck all.